Greetings. My name is Rabbi Matt Dreffin. I am the Director of Education at the Goldring-Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life, which is located in Jackson, Mississippi. It's my honor to be here for the Global Day of Jewish Learning with the topic this year of the bonds between us. And as someone who works with a lot of people in the South, our rural communities that are farmers, our fishers are connected to the land in the Shemitah year, I could not get my mind away from thinking about anything other than trees modeling connectivity. Now, when we think of trees and getting set to explore them, the first question that came to mind was, of course, what is the first instance of eights in the Torah? We know there are trees all over the place in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, but where's the first instance? And when we turn to it, we read Genesis 1 in the first chapter, verses 11 through 12, pretty early on. Vayomer Elohim tadshei haaretz desha esev mazria zera eitz peri ose peri lemino. Asher zar ovo al haaretz vayhi chen v'totzei haaretz desha esav mazria zera leminehu ve'eitz ose peri asher zar ovo v'minehu vayar Elohim kitov. God said, let the earth sprout grasses, vegetation yielding seed, and fruit tree bearing fruit in its kind, in which upon the earth. And it was so. The earth produced grasses, vegetation yielding seed in its kind, and a tree bearing fruit in which there was seed in its kind. And God saw that it was good. So here we have very early on in Genesis 1, the occurrence of the word eitz, the occurrence of the word tree appearing twice, which is exciting to say. Whenever we're looking at the Tanakh, whenever we're looking at Torah, we look to see where is there repetition, where are there words that are being used in unique ways and all that sort of stuff. So right on, there's some prominence, and some people might say, oh, it's just the pattern of how the Torah goes. It says God says something with words and brings things into creation using words, and then the Torah narrates that exactly as it was said, or approximately exactly what it said. And someone might say, yes, of course it makes sense. Trees were created relatively early on because we need all these plants and stuff for biological processes. But when we think, if we're even moderately versed in the Torah, we understand that there is a second creation story, of course, and that begs the question: is eitz, is there a tree in the second creation story? I should note that the translations that I'm using in English are approximations. They're the style from the Steinsaltz Chumash with some editing for gendered language. In Genesis 2:9, this is the second creation story. We read, "Vayatzmach Adonai Elohim min ha'adama kol eitz nechmad lemar'eh v'tov lema'achal ve'etz hachayim betoch hagan ve'etz hada'at tov v'ra'a." Adonai Elohim grew from the ground every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So here again, we have an approximation of repetition. One verse, the word tree appearing 3 times, which is very exciting because this is the topic that we want to look at. A tree appears not just twice in 2 verses, but once 3 times in 1 verse. And the question goes, okay, when we're trying to investigate this and say, is there something more to it? We always want to turn to our sages and see what they have to say. Do they have any sort of insight for us? A lot of the commentators focus on the line where it says in the midst of the garden, and they want to inquire, is it in the exact middle of the garden? Is it, in the midst, meaning anywhere spread out all over the place, north, south, east, west, et cetera, et cetera. And many of them are concerned with this. But one of our commentators, as noted in the Steinsaltz Chumash, Ramban, identifies something a little bit different. It is possible that the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil were not separate trees, but different sides of the same tree, 2 branches or trunks that grew from the same root. So if we've ever been out in the woods, if we've ever seen trees grow up, sometimes we'll see 2 or 3 of them that look like they're very close together, growing up from the same root. And it's not necessarily healthy for these trees to be in competition with each other, fighting for the sunlight and all that sort of stuff. But it's this interesting notion that Ramban either noticed from natural processes or was just saying, no, it's perhaps that these things are are connected. Being in the South, you may also be familiar with a tree that uses its roots to send up new trees, not necessarily just at its base, but a little bit away from it, almost appearing like a separate tree. So here we have a Crape Myrtle. It's spelled any number of different ways. And what's really interesting in Jackson here, this house has 3 Crape Myrtles. There's one off screen over here, where every year it will send up a shooter right in the middle of the yard. It appears as if it's its own different tree, but it's actually a root system that's sending out a feeder over here. This one in the background always sends up one over on the other side of these turquoise chairs. And then my favorite one that these trees send out is there's one that actually appears on the other side of this sidewalk that approaches the house. It comes up right here. It's actually just this tree sending one out. So it's possible that we're looking at these roots and the notion of the trees in the garden, that they're the same tree, that it might not actually be something that's separate, and talking about those connections. It got me wondering with these, looking with at Ramban's understanding and thinking about like him using the word root, what it shows about our contemporary, what we can learn from what we know about the natural world. And research recently suggests that some trees can communicate with each other through root systems, which is a really exciting concept. Now, what the research has shown is not that the tree is the same root communicating with itself, but actually there's filial ends in the funguses that are at the end of the roots. So trees that are not the same tree, they can actually connect and communicate and form bonds with each other through the soil and communicate about what's going on with droughts and what's going on with animals and all sorts of stuff. There is a separate study which looked at one tree and tried to analyze and figure out like what's its connection. And it wasn't connected with 1, 2, or 3 trees around it, but based on what they were noticing in their research was there actually, this one tree was connected to 47 other trees, which is a lot of trees to be connected to in a small area, and really exciting, the notion to think about what this means. What could this mean for us, especially if we explore in the Tanakh the word root? Is it possible that the root is not just a root, but is sometimes used as a metaphor for us to understand something about ourselves and our lives? When we look at Deuteronomy 29:17, it says, "Pen yesh bachem ish o isha o mishpacha o shevet asher levavo Foneh hayom me'im Adonai Eloheinu lalechet la'avod et Elohei hagoyim hahem pen yesh bachem shoresh poreh rosh v'la'ana," which means, of course, lest there is among you a man or a woman or a family or a tribe whose heart turns away today from God, Adonai our God, to go to serve the gods of those nations, lest there's among you a root producing gall and wormwood. So this is important to notice that put in context that in Deuteronomy here, God is concerned, rightfully so, about the ancient Israelites being tempted by the lowercase g gods of the local cultures and turning away from Adonai and breaking one of the 10 commandments. And we have this word that's getting used, the root right here, the shoresh, as a metaphor, because it's not talking about actual roots in the ground. And gall and wormwood, the rosh v'la'ana, are sometimes translated various different ways. What's known is that they're suspected to be poisonous plants. They're toxic plants that can take over and corrupt what's around them. So here we have a clear instance of the Bible showing us the notion of like a root somewhere around us can actually in the Torah, the ancient Israelites were concerned with this one person affecting another in a way that they may not even realize. And it got me thinking about family system dynamics and unseen bonds, essentially. What are the ways in which we're tied to other people? A very basic understanding of family systems is we like to think of ourselves as existing in a vacuum, that we are our own person and we have a lot of control over how we're feeling and what we're up to and all that sort of stuff. But it's the world is actually more complicated than that, and that we are tied, we're connected to others, we have bonds with them. So let's just take us as individuals. Oftentimes we have a parent, perhaps that parent and we are lucky enough that they have a sibling, sometimes called an aunt or uncle, but we're going to call it a parent sibling for the sake of understanding this simple notion. And then, of course, the work friend. And what we don't know is that there's a line of connections between us that jumps to one to the next, and everything's fine. We don't even notice it. However, it may be that the work friend has a very traumatic event happen to them, and that subsequently affects the parent sibling who's very close with that work friend. Of course, growing up with a sibling and communicating with them, even as an adult, can affect you. And then all of a sudden, you're wondering, you really want your parent to be happy, and they seem upset about something, and you want them to be better, so it can affect your mood. So there's this notion that in family systems dynamics is it's, again, there's all sorts of factors that are at play, pushing and pulling and all this sort of connectedness. And when we extrapolate that further out to look at our lives as a whole, we start to see all sorts of connections that are going on. How many degrees away are we connected to people, and all that sort of stuff. And this first part of understanding the trees and the roots as connection, and these bonds that tie us that we don't necessarily see, these underground systems, begs us to take stock of some pretty big questions. And that is, what unseen connections do we have in our lives with others? What are the ways in which we're connected that we're not even realizing it? We might know, oh, this is my desk mate at work, but what are the ways in which I'm connected to other people through them? How might those unseen connections affect us on a daily basis? So this is really bringing some mindfulness to our relationships, and not just in that moment, but to be aware and reflective on who we're interacting with, and then who they're interacting with. And of course, what can we do to make those connections positive for us and others? We don't want to be introducing any gall and wormwood into our lives. They're poisonous, they're toxic. So what are the ways in which we're connected, and we can figure out all the ways in which these unseen bonds, these connections are interacting with us in a way that we don't even realize. I'm going to turn for a moment, because as I was researching, looking for the word eights, I discovered that there's another word for tree that gets used in the Genesis story that Midrash understands as a word for tree. And you'll see, we'll get into it in a pretty good depth here in a moment. The verse we're looking at is Genesis 2:5, where it says, "V'chol siach hasadeh terem Adonai ba'aretz, v'chol esev hasadeh terem yitzmach." I cut it short because that's really all we need for right now, which is no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no vegetation of the field had yet sprouted. So we find out about the eights later in a couple of verses, but here it's using the word siach for shrub, which if the root siach, it's actually about conversation, about talking. And it's really interesting that it refers to, some people debate whether there's actually a difference between shrub and tree categorically when you're talking about plants and categorizing them. And it's almost like the Torah was already there and onto them. So immediately we turn to the Midrash, and it cues in on why did the Torah not use eights? Why did it not use the natural word, the normal word for tree? And the fascinating take is this. We look at Bereshit Rabbah 13:2. That's Midrash Genesis Rabbah. It says, "Kol ha'elan not," and elan is often translated as cedar. It's a tree. Kol ha'ilanot ke'ilu mesichin, that's our word siach, mesichin elu im elu. Kol ha'ilanot ke'ilu mesichin im habriot. Kol ha'ilanot lahana'atan shel briot nivratu. That translates, of course, when we look at it, all the trees, as it were, conversed with each other. So here the Midrash is saying, wait, trees talk to each other. The trees are literally having conversations with each other. And the next line I loved was, all the trees, as it were, conversed with humanity. So why this word siach is here is to tell us that there's communication happening with trees. They're not just objects that stand over there that we're not supposed to interact. And then, of course, all the trees were created for humanity's companionship. The notion that we are supposed to be not just conversing, but in almost like in relationship with them, in conversation with them. And this, again, in thinking through trees and what I'd read recently, came up with, there's more than just the root system. There's also some more interesting ways in which trees communicate with each other, one of which is the acacia trees, and especially around giraffes. So the acacia tree exists, in Africa, and it's a very tall tree. If we were to walk up to it with, say, a knife and carve on its bark, low, nothing really is going to happen. But there's something about the acacia tree that's figured out. There's this really tall animal, the giraffe, that likes to come along and eat it. And what it will actually do is it will produce a gas, and that gas will communicate with the acacia trees around it. And they will actually produce a gas that can knock out a large mammal, render it unconscious. Which is a fascinating notion of that the trees are in conversation with each other, literally in a physiological and a way in which they are interacting with each other and using chemicals and stuff to say, hey, I'm being attacked, I'm being eaten, start putting out this gas to protect yourself. That's really notion. The piece of the Midrash that really got fascinating was the notion that we are supposed to be not tree huggers, but we're supposed to be in companionship, in conversation with the trees. I don't know how many of you have ever gone out and actually just like had a conversation with a tree. But what's really interesting, and I recently discovered, is in preparing for this, is that Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, in I and Thou, speaks of a tree. So he's trying to get us to understand the concept that he's trying to teach us, to not see to not have I-it relations, to not have transactional relationships, but to truly be present and accountable to and for one another. And he actually almost does a sort of meditation where he says, and we can kind of do it here. And here's a picture of some local trees here in Jackson, is to say, I can look at a tree and I can break it down by its properties for which it's made. What are its chemical elements? What are on the periodic table that actually make it? I can look at a tree and I can notice its colorization, and for how how does the light balance off the leaves, off the bark, and how is that just a reflection of an absorption of certain colors? I can look at a tree for the mathematical ways in which it is broken down. He does all this sort of stuff that we can literally close our eyes and then open them on a tree and meditate all the various ways in which we can categorize it and not interact with it, not be in relationship. And that's the thing he really wants us to get at, is how can we be in conversation with the trees? How can we see them for their whole? And that is just, he's using it as the starting point to understand, okay, if we are supposed to be this way with an inanimate but living object, all the more so, how are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to be in conversation, siach, with the eitzim, the trees, and with our fellow humans, which leads us to our three more big questions, which is, how are we interacting with, not just subduing, our local flora? So the notion that we're supposed to be in companionship, we're supposed to be in conversation. A lot of people just want to mow over their yard and not deal with planting different plants and having good biodiversity. What are the ways in which we can interact with it, not just subdue it and overtake it? Because we think through, other parts in Genesis tell us we're supposed to just we have dominion over all the animals in the earth. And there's some other parts in the Torah, like looking at the trees, that's saying, no, there's something else going on. Secondly, how can we be more connected in the company of others? So this notion of conversation, how can we be making more conversation and really forging bonds with others when we talk with them, not just transactionally using them for our own gain and our own purposes. And then last, of course, how can we converse more positively and presently every day? How can we be in that moment with people where we are not just there and thinking about our own answers, but how can we see them for their whole selves? And how can we be a part of their lives and have them be a part of our lives, that we can have true, authentic interactions to understand our underground root connections, as well as those direct connections through our words. So I hope you've gotten a little bit out of this as I have. I want to thank you for your time and hope that this presentation has been of note to you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful Shemitah year, thinking about the bonds between us for Global Day of Jewish Learning.